Today, we are going to be talking about activities right at the dead center of yield management in digital media, which is how to set prices and price floors in both managed and programmatic environments. My guest today is Paul Lewis. Paul has over 20 years of experience working at various incantations of AOL, Oath, Verizon Media, and Yahoo, and that's where I first met Paul. He has had responsibilities in functions like marketing and program management, but for much of the last decade, he has been firmly in the middle of digital management, of yield management. So he has become a vice president in yield management for the last 8 years. Paul, I am so glad that we are able to connect.
Yeah, thanks for having me, James. I've really enjoyed the video series to date, and I'm excited to delve into the world of rate card setting with you.
Excellent. Well, let's get into it. Paul, the first time that you and I met was in the process of bringing AOL and Yahoo's yield management functions together. Both companies had rigorous approaches to set prices, and we had to find a way to resolve the differences. Now, I am going to be extremely careful to stay away from how Yahoo sets prices now, or even the types of conversations that we had 6 or 7 years ago. So let me just stay at the conceptual level and say that there are different frameworks that could be applied. And you and I often had discussions around the types of frameworks that could be applied and when it might be appropriate to use one versus another. And where I want to start is this idea of one framework called a tops-down approach, another that's called bottoms-up, and when one might be appropriate versus another. So if you could define those terms for me, talk about where they might be useful and the types of different products and different environments where they may be applicable.
Sure thing. When we think about pricing strategy and yield management, tactics and operations may change from publisher to publisher. However, when we think about the overall strategy, most decisions do boil down to those two frameworks. For inventory that's non-differentiated and more likely to transact through a programmatic channel, a bottoms-up approach is appropriate. At its core, bottoms-up is taking the cost of a product and applying against a fixed percentage to mark up the cost. And in most cases, this is a fairly straightforward process. However, when we think about digital media inventory, there's a few considerations. The inventory is transient, and there's not a hard cost per se. So in order to create that framework, the first step is to look at the opportunity cost of the inventory. And in that case, we're looking at average clearing rates and average fill rates, calculating the cost by priority level. So when we think about the standard waterfall model, at the bottom, we have remnant or filler inventory and monetizes at the lowest rates. So for this framework, the first step would be to create an opportunity cost for that level, mark it up, which creates a floor for the next priority level up, which in this case would be the open environment. And then you'd replicate that process for each priority going up the chain. So what this model does is it really protects against cannibalization of blocking higher paying demand. Most large publishers these days would use dynamic flooring to calculate the hard cost. But then for higher priority products like private marketplaces, typically a yield team would monitor that on a regular basis and make adjustments based on seasonal trends and other demand trends.
So Paul, before you go on off of a bottoms-up approach, and we can talk about a tops-down here in a moment, but just playing that back in terms of the type of examples. So if I'm understanding correctly, you would use this if you're a publisher and you're selling a relatively undifferentiated product let's say a run of network type product, but it's demanded by your advertisers who you have a direct relationship with. You look at the prices that inventory might be getting in an open market through some kind of exchange, and let's say the open exchange rate is 50 cents. You're talking about a situation where, okay, you can get 50 cents for that. So that's your baseline, your opportunity cost.
Right.
And so you're going to start with that 50 cents and think about, okay, now I may set up a private marketplace. It's going to be X% higher than that 50 cents. So maybe you're going to price it at 70 or 75 cents. You're going to think about other ways you might repackage that inventory. Maybe you're going to sell a product that's a managed product, run of network, that delivers at a higher priority than programmatic. So you're going to go up again from 75 cents up to $1 or some higher price. So it's like a series of building blocks. Am I thinking about that in the right way?
That's correct. So the process would include using multipliers to make sure that there are premiums at the different levels of the waterfall, and to make sure that if targeting is applied or for better performing inventory that's being packaged, that the appropriate premium is being applied to account for that better performance.
Got it. So in that sense, bottoms up, firmly anchored in sort of the opportunity cost or potentially the direct cost, although, as you mentioned, much less relevant in most digital media types of environments. So if that's an approach where there is a good programmatic baseline, what is top-down approaching, and when might that be appropriate?
Right, so a top-down model would be used for inventory that is differentiated in the market and has more of a premium value proposition. So in this case, think about things like sponsorships, branded content, unique formats, really any inventory that has a higher propensity to sell direct. And for this framework, an opportunity cost would still be calculated and used internally to set a hard floor for direct sales. But the actual rate card itself would be based on other attributes, such as elasticity, looking at average sold rates and fill rates in the past, as well as other feedback, such as the willingness to pay, what types of clients may be interested in that type of product, and how does it compare to other solutions in the market. For the more unique solutions, there's less options, so the premium should be higher. So the main point of this type of model is really to protect the value of inventory that is the most unique and the most scarce, to make sure that overall rates aren't being diluted.
So one of the things I'm hearing is it's potentially with inventory that's more valuable, maybe where there isn't a clear market in terms of lots of liquidity. There isn't an auction or exchange that you can benchmark against. Does that mean, and you and I are sitting here early in the year 2025, would this apply more to products that are more niche, like CTV, digital out of home, things where they're either less traded programmatically, where they're and if so, how would you think about applying the framework to those areas?
Well, in some cases, there may be products that don't backfill at all and are only sold direct. And in that case, we'd want to look at the inherent value of the inventory. So again, going back to, are there other products that we can anchor against? What does performance look like? And again, how unique or how differentiated is that inventory in market? And has anything similar been sold in the past to use as an anchor as well? So again, in this case, the process is a little more of a blend of art and science than pure science, where we take those qualitative and quantitative inputs to kind of calculate a starting point for how the inventory should be valued.
So let me push on that a little bit, because even though I acknowledge it is a little bit more art than science, I've talked in other formats or other forums about this idea of using different attributes to think about the inherent value of products. And those attributes could be things like the size of the ad unit. Certainly a larger billboard by the side of the road is going to be more valuable than a smaller one. The type or size of audience that is going to see a placement, the location of the placement, the persistence. So, clearly there are attributes that you can use to factor in. How might you think about which of those attributes might be appropriate to use? Because I've just thrown 5 things at you. You mentioned a number of others, including things like sell-through rate. And presumably you aren't going to try to use 10 different attributes in your model. How, if someone's hearing this for the first time and they're like, yeah, tops down sounds like the way I might need to do this, how should they think about what are the right attributes for them when they're thinking about trying to price some products?
I think the starting point is the nature of the unit. So if we're talking about a larger format or something that can be anchored against standard formats, you'd want to look at the size of the unit, maybe normalize to a price per pixel, and use that as a starting point to come up with where that product should be anchored. In other cases, there have been products that are completely groundbreaking, completely new. And in those cases, the process is a bit more convoluted because there's not much to go off of. So those cases, that's where I think it becomes more of an art, where we pull in some of the qualitative feedback. What is the value prop in the market? Or any other publishers offered something similar? And that's where, it is a blend between the qualitative and quantitative.
Got it. Let me, I don't know if what we've been discussing is relatively easy stuff, but let's get to some of the tougher stuff, or some of the stuff that yield managers, some of the questions they hate being asked. And I think one of the questions that I used to hate being asked was how to do benchmarking, how to compare how we as an organization might be doing against our competitors or against the market. How are we doing this year versus others? So when you think about benchmarking, how would you think about the sources that you might want to go to? And let's focus on the positive, because I think you and I could spend all day on some of the inherent challenges or problems with some of the vendors in the space. If we focus on the positives, what are your experiences with the best sources for competitive benchmarking? And in particular, what are the things that people need to be careful to watch out for?
Right. And I agree, there's always high demand to pull in competitive benchmarks. In the past, we've gotten requests from multiple groups. So yield would use as a consideration when pricing, but other teams such as BizDev may use those insights to calculate fair market value when working on an external partnership. So these insights are very valuable. And one thing that I want to point out is there's really not a silver bullet. So there's not one source in the market that will have everything that a team is looking for to truly understand actual rates in the market. So the best approach is to use various sources or a few sources and triangulate. On the programmatic side, there's a few vendors that work with publishers on reporting solutions, ingest the data, aggregate, and create a benchmarking suite. I've worked with vendors such as Stack, which is now part of Operative, Bird Intelligence, on pulling in some of these insights. The data is extremely reliable because it's coming from actual campaigns, and they allow for a multitude of different filtering, so you can pull in trends by transaction type, art size, the key variables that would drive rates in the market. However, when we use those sources, it needs to be in a directional way, because there's other variables that aren't as transparent, such as targeting layers or the ad density on the page, which also affect rate and may not be reflected in the aggregation of that data. But overall, to look at general trends of the market, those sources are extremely valuable. There's another tool called Pathmatics. Oh, sorry, James.
No, keep going.
As I said, there's another tool called Pathmatics, which I've used in the past, and it's primarily used as a share of wallet tool to understand how ads are monetizing on different publishers, different advertisers. but it does include a breakout of channels to differentiate between direct and indirect. So that's another valuable tool to understand what the channel mix looks like and how pricing might be blended for some of these sites.
When you are seeing these kinds of dynamics, let's stay with the examples you gave first of Stack and Burt, where they use real campaigns. As you mentioned, it has the advantage that if you're using real data, you know it's grounded in reality, but you may not know which reality it's part of. And by that, what I mean is, how do you factor in the fact that how different individual buyers may be swaying the data set?
Right. So those tools do break out by DSP, by SSP. However, to your point, the data is not weighted. So it's difficult to understand which demand sources are driving the average. So again, in those cases, the best approach is to use directionally to understand overall movement. And when the trends don't necessarily align with other sources, or there's something behind the scenes, it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Sometimes we've worked with account managers at those vendors to get a little more insight, but that is one of the issues with some of those tools. It's impossible to understand what the true drivers are, so it needs to be used from more of a 500-foot level.
How do you think about the potential ways you can check your sourcing of that? So I'll give you a couple of examples and you can tell me whether you think they're useful. You might check against your own performance. If you're a publisher, you know exactly how you performed over the last few months, and so you could check whether the vendors are seeing that accurately. Another potential way you could check them would be to check their performance against publicly reported financials for the biggest companies, whether it's a Meta, a Google, maybe some of the biggest publishers. They have their financials that they have to report. Granted, they don't always break out their advertising businesses in the same way, but just to sort of put a bow on this, using different forms of benchmarking, how do you go about validating those different sources?
You're right. So that's actually going to bring up earnings reports are another valuable resource. And they tend to provide other metrics that can be helpful to kind of understand performance. So Google and Meta both provide average daily revenue per user, which is another way to kind of understand and engage the health of the business. But to validate the overall data, one tactic that we have used is to normalize based on what we're seeing against our own data. So if eCPMs are off by 15%, we'd assume a certain range, plus minus percentages, and kind of gauge, that way knowing that it's not going to be 100% precise.
And I don't know if it's an answer to the example you just gave, but many of those vendors don't have insight into things like whether there is bonus being applied against a campaign, etc. And so is that the kind of reason that you might just apply an aggregate factor to scale up or scale down their performance, because you accept that they either don't apply bonus, and we know that X percentage of bonus is being used, or what would be the reasons that you would think about, that would influence it one way or the other?
Right. So when we use data from those vendors, we have to assume that it's fully diluted. So when we compare internally, we should use a fully diluted metric, but then also trend against our sold rates and understand that, those benchmarks are going to be somewhere in between. But again, I think the main use is to understand how a publisher is indexing against the overall movement of rates. So for example, if 1 month or 1 quarter rates are up by 15% across the board in the industry based on these sources, but the publisher seeing flat to negative trends, it'd be the first step to kind of dig in. Has anything changed? What do we think we're seeing across the different sources that may be driving that change? And in some cases, Again, it could be based on the way that the sources and the data is being pulled in, where we may see that blip using one source, but then validating that against another. It may not be the same trend. So in that case, there's understanding that, again, it could be due to one of the issues with not having full transparency with how the benchmarks are being calculated.
Okay. I want to ask you about new product introductions, which again, I'm only asking you tough questions today, which again is one of those areas that I think makes a lot of pricing yield managers cringe a little bit, because it's a difficult problem. And I'll differentiate here. I think often yield managers, in a status quo type of environment, you're making adjustments to your rate card year over year or quarter over quarter. And the signals that determine whether you do that are based on market conditions, sell-through rates. Is there demand for that type of product? And so pricing your existing products can often be well understood or relatively routine. And in contrast, pricing of a new product launch or a new product introduction can be relatively difficult, because you don't have that baseline history. You don't have necessarily a sense for how well it's going to be received by the market. And so I think it genuinely is one of the most difficult problems that pricing managers face. How have you thought about new product introductions historically in your career, and what advice do you have for approaching them?
So I would say the first step is to understand if there's a way to anchor the new product. So in cases of standard IAB formats, there typically is enough data, between internal and external resources to find that anchor. And when we look at that initial rate, we typically want to filter by the key variables that drive performance, such as art size, page type, maybe a content tier. So is the content of the page more similar to a different site, perhaps? And typically there's a narrow range of performance where it's more or less straightforward to divide that initial price point. Now, in cases of a brand new format or something extremely innovative in the market, that's obviously a little tougher. In the case of a brand new large format, going back to that tops down, the first step would be to look at, okay, what is the size of the unit? Can we normalize based on how much of the landscape on the page is taking up? Then looking at the functionality of the unit. Is it intrusive? Do we expect higher performance because of the layout or the animation, different aspects of the new unit? And again, some of it does come down to that qualitative input. So is there demand for that type of unit in the market? Is it coming from feedback from a specific advertiser or agency? And we would incorporate that. I would say for those types of formats, sometimes it is difficult to get initial demand in the market because you don't have that baseline. So actually moving that inventory and getting initial demand is a challenge. In some cases, it makes sense to package that in with other inventory in order to, again, get some demand and understand what the performance is to build off of, adjust rates going forward, and also create collateral so that the teams can go in with a greater go-to-market strategy.
When you think about that new product and it's launching, is your bias to price it slightly on the higher side or on the lower side?
You would always want to buffer in and price at a premium. And one thing that is always consistent, it's always easier to bring down a rate after it's been established in the market than bring it up. The latter is almost impossible once a rate has been shared over a few months.
I don't know if it's because we worked together for so long, but obviously I agree with you on this. Now, I think the only additional thing I would say on that is it's critical to get a couple of sort of pilot customers for that launch. And you may, if they are getting early access to a product and we acknowledge that we don't really know what the price is, so it's on the high side, that they may get some temporary sort of pricing during the pilot program in exchange for something that they might give, be it insights about the performance or the ability to participate in a case study. I think one of the things we often get very hung up on when we talk about pricing is the number of the price and forget about all of the other attributes that go into the relationship. And certainly when there's a new product introduction, you are trying to make sure that new product introduction is successful. And for that, you need case studies, market information, etc. And all of that has value and may be worth working with an advertiser where they can get effectively a lower price in the short term in exchange for some other considerations. Would that be fair?
I would say too, from a client relationship standpoint, it also helps, right? If we identify, top advertisers, ones where we feel like the budgets can be increased, where there's some opportunity there, it makes them feel like they're getting something that the rest of the market isn't. So from that standpoint, it's very helpful for the relationship.
Excellent. Hey, Paul, thank you for taking the time to do this. As I reflect on the questions I've asked you, I think I've asked you harder questions than anybody else I've had on this podcast. So I really appreciate it. What is the best way for people to find you online or in any other way?
Thanks, James. I can be found on LinkedIn at Paul D-Lewis. And my email is lewispaul04@AOL. And it'd be great to chat in more detail with anyone that's interested in the stuff.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Paul. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks, James.